Professor Asma is an assistant professor of Islamic Studies at UCLA in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. Her primary research interests are in early and classical Muslim social history and the intersection of law and social history, gender, and the history of Muslim education. Her book, Women and the Transmission of Religious Knowledge in Islam, analyzes Muslim women's religious education, specifically their transmission of hadith from the rise of Islam to the early Ottoman period. She received her PhD from the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. She was previously assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Lafayette College, where she taught courses in Islam and world religions. She's published on topics related to Muslim women and their religious participation in journals, such as Studia Islamica and Islamic Law and Society, and has contributed a number of encyclopedia articles on women's history in early and classical Islam. She recently undertook archival research in Syria on Muslim women's education in the Ayyubid and Mamluk periods under the auspices of the Fulbright Fellowship. We're very proud to have Professor Asma join us. Thank you.
Okay, if you will, just give me a moment to set myself up here. Yes, that's what I was worried about. Okay, got it. Okay, thank you. I don't need any technical assistance, thank you. Okay, so Assalamu alaikum. It's really wonderful to be here and to be part of this conversation. I want to thank Salam for the invitation and to all of the organizing organizations for putting this together. So before I begin, I want to clarify what might be a very technical point for some of you, but it's important for me to sort of assert this in the beginning so I don't get called out on it later, is that I'm using the term Sīra very, very broadly to refer to all reports and accounts about the Prophet. I am not considering whether they're only found in what is properly known as Sīra literature or tafsir or hadith. So anything that relates to the Prophet is, I would say, fair game in my consideration here. So I want to actually begin by talking about a passage from the, that's okay. That's good. From the Tafsir al-Bayan of the well-known 10th century Muslim scholar Muhammad ibn Jarir al-Tabari, who died in 923. And in the example that I'm citing here, al-Tabari is explaining the historical context for the revelation of a very well-known verse, one is the subject of much debate, especially in the United States, and that's the Quranic verse 434. And it reads, "Men are in charge of women because Allah has made the one of them excel over the other, and because they spend of their property for the support of women. So good women are obedient, guarding in secret that which God has guarded, and as for those from whom you fear rebellion, admonish them and banish them to beds apart." And Pickthall has it as scourge them, some others have it as beat them, I will just say daraba. And if they obey you, seek not a way against them. God is ever high, exalted, and great. And keep in mind again that this is a Tabari explaining this verse, understanding it in the 10th century. And he looks at the context of revelation of this verse, and he says that it was revealed in the case of a man who slapped his wife. And she went to the prophet to complain to him. And the prophet at that time determined that the woman had the right of retaliation against her husband. We don't know what the details of that retaliation look like, but essentially that she did have the right to get back at him, as it were. And At-Tabari says, God then around that time revealed the verse 434, and the prophet moved away from his earlier judgment about retaliation and said, I wanted one thing and God wanted something else. So as probably most of you know, there are many, many debates on the meaning and application of this Quranic verse, 434, especially in the West. And these debates have resulted in just sort of a widespread public knowledge, which I think is unusual, about reports from the Sīra literature, such as this one that we find in Tabari. And there are numerous other reports like this that reflect the Prophet's understanding of justice in domestic relations, his kindness, and his mercy. And the report that I just shared with you about what the Prophet judged in the case of this woman who came to him is especially striking, because in it, what we see is that the Prophet's aversion to a husband exercising any kind of physical sort of disciplining act, let's say, towards his wife is so strong, it's so deep in him that his own desire or his own ruling on this is something different from what the Quranic verse seems to say. So when interpreting the Quran and articulating what we might call the fiqh of domestic relations, Muslim scholars integrated the Prophet's exemplary behavior into their works. And in the case of Quran 434, the very strong reports about the Prophet's hatred of physical disciplining of his wives, his own kindness to his wives, is very deeply embedded in the logic of the interpretation of the verse. So many scholars, very interestingly, right? I mean, for those of you who are familiar with the Arabic discussions of this verse will understand this and appreciate it in particular. So what most scholars have done is interpret Quran 434 not as a verse that actually gives permission, but as a verse that very strongly limits when and how husbands can discipline their wives. So for example, a Shafi'i in the 9th century wrote that darb, however you want to translate it, is permitted, but avoiding it is much better. And Ibn Arabi, a 13th century Quran scholar, said that in the 8th century, Ata, who's an early jurist, felt that beating is actually detestable. It's makruh on the basis of other reports from the Prophet. So this is a very extraordinary sort of embedding of the Prophet's legacy into the Quranic tafsir material. So Shafi'i, Ibn Arabi, and many other jurists were inclined to this interpretation because, as I said, in the Sīra literature, there are numerous accounts that the Prophet was a loving and kind husband and a father who exercised patience in all of his domestic affairs. And this is especially remarkable in the context of his own environment, and given that we have countless other reports that show that hitting women, physically disciplining them, or exercising what we might call excessive anger in our societies today, expressing that, it was a routine practice in the context of his time, and it was not something that was frowned down upon. So I'm starting with this not because I want to focus on domestic violence in this talk. That is a topic that deserves probably its own lecture and its own conference, but I'm using this as an example of a category or a type of account in the Sīra literature that I want to call attention to in the time that I have today. And in describing these reports, or this category, I'm going to sort of invade the territory of the scientists and call them potential energy accounts. And that is because of the potential that they represent for American Muslims to actualize positive patterns of personal behavior and interaction, and to ground all of this in the exemplary model of the Prophet. So moving on from the issue of darb, Quran 434, and the Prophet's exemplary conduct in this regard, I want to discuss a different case study, and that is of women's attendances in mosques and their participation in congregational prayers. So if you look at all of the reports, and there are quite a lot of them about women's attendance of mosques in this, that fall under this rubric that I'm calling Sīra Literature. I mean, many of them are hadith proper that occur in canonical collections. What you see is there are 4 categories of hadith, or 4 types of hadith. The first is the one that gives explicit permission for women to attend mosques and to participate in jama'at, in congregational prayers. The second is where the permission is implicit, because they indicate that women were present in mosques during the time of the Prophet. The third are reports that prescribe the proper behavior for women who go to mosques, such as don't call attention to yourself, don't wear perfume, etc. So here too, the permission is implicit. And lastly, there are reports that actually discourage women from going out for prayers. And in the first category, for example, we have a very explicit statement of the Prophet that says, do not forbid the actual Arabic might translate into something like the maidservants of God. Well, let's just say, don't forbid women or the servants of God from the mosques of God. And in the second category, I'm going to just cite a few of these examples. This is from Sahih al-Bukhari and a few other collections where Aisha radiallahu anha says, the believing woman covered with their veiling sheets used to attend the dawn prayer, the Fajr prayer with the Prophet, and after finishing the prayer, they would return to their homes. And another example of this comes from Asma bint Abi Bakr, who was the sister of Aisha bint Abi Bakr, and this is in sections on the prayer for the solar eclipse. And so Asma says, the sun eclipsed during the lifetime of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and I came and entered the mosque and saw the messenger of God standing up in prayer. I joined him in prayer, but he kept standing up so long that I felt I needed to sit down. And she looked around and she noticed that there was a weak woman standing next to her, and the report says, I would say to myself, she's even weaker than me, and so I would keep standing. So this is an example of where, the report itself is not about women going to mosques, not about explicit permission that the Prophet granted women to go to mosques, but they're clearly there and they're participating in congregational prayer. There are 2 other very interesting reports. One is from Atika bint Zayd, who is the wife of Umar ibn al-Khattab, and the report says that she used to offer the Fajr prayer and the Aisha prayer in congregation in the mosque. And some of the people who were in the mosque asked her, why do you come out for prayer, even though you know that Umar doesn't like it and that it makes him jealous? And she said, then why doesn't he stop me from going to the mosque? And they said, what prevents him is the statement of God, of the Prophet, do not prevent women from going to the mosques. Okay, so we have here an example of a companion who is curbing his instincts because of the prophetic statement. And here's another one, again, that involves Umar ibn al-Khattab and his family. It says, Bilal ibn Abdullah ibn Umar ibn al-Khattab, so the grandson of Umar ibn al-Khattab, said that one day his father, Abdullah ibn Umar, said, I heard the Prophet say, do not deprive the female slaves of Allah, that is women, and of their share in the mosques. And Bilal said, as for me, I am going to forbid the woman of my household from going to the mosque. But whoever wants to let his woman go out, that's fine, they can do that. So the report continues, says, my father Abdullah turned to Bilal and said, may God curse you, may God curse you, may God curse you. It's repeated 3 times. You hear me say that the Prophet ordered that women are not to be deprived, and you say otherwise. And Abdullah wept and he left. So very strongly worded reports that rely on prophetic precedent to open up spaces, as it were, for women's public participation in mosques, in congregational prayers. Now, what's very interesting about this is that if you look at the history of legal interpretation, right, you see that the reports in the first three categories that permit women to go to mosques and permit their participation are far more numerous than reports in the last category. And the reports in the last category, those that prohibit women, are actually narrated with problematic chains of transmission. They're considered weak, etc. But when you look at what we call classical legal discourse, that is from the 8th century all the way up to around the 15th century, what you see is that the weak hadith played a far greater role in guiding and justifying juristic discourse on this topic, such that there were many jurists who said women should be discouraged from going to the mosques, right? Because their presence in the public space is a source of fitna, and in the end, that is a far more important consideration than all these other reports that we have. But in contrast to what we see in Islamic law in the early and classical periods, what we find in American Muslim context, for me, is really interesting, because what you see here is the actualization of what I call these potential energy hadith, right? So those are, again, the ones that promote women's participation in mosques, that promote their their attendance of congregational prayers. And it is this actualization of the hadith that has empowered American Muslims to promote and support the creation of woman-friendly spaces in mosques, and also in their national organizations. So some of you are probably aware that ISNA has a statement on this, on woman-friendly mosques, and it is what we might, I guess in the language of teenagers today, it's a thing, right? That there is this movement called the Woman-Friendly Mosque Movement. So it's this type of creative reflection and borrowing that I think can be very transformative and powerful when we talk about a project like the American Seerah Project. So I'm going to give one other example, and that is of reports or accounts of the Prophet's interaction with wives and women beyond his immediate family, that is, beyond the circle of his wives and his children. And what I want to do here is actually share with you what I thought to be a very moving narrative or a reimagination, a rethinking of this from the biography of the Prophet written by a woman named Leslie Hazelton, whom some of you may know. She's actually not a Muslim, but she's done a tremendous work in terms of promoting the positive image of Islam and the biography of the Prophet. And I like this because I think it's a great example of an American who, again, is not Muslim, but being inspired by Seerah to produce a Seerah, again, but that is produced by a non-Muslim, but I don't have any problems with that, that resonates very much in the American context. So I want to just read a couple of passages from this to give you an example of what I'm talking about. If I can find them. Okay, so Leslie Hazelton is talking about the moments after the Prophet received the first revelation, and as you all know, these were moments that really shook him to the core. And the Sīra Literature description on this is very graphic and sometimes unsettling. And this is Leslie Hazelton's rewriting or reimagining of it. Muhammad was left cowering on the ground, depleted. Covered in sweat, yet shivering, he was inhabited by those words that were his and yet not his. The words he had repeated out loud into the thin, pure air of the mountain, into the emptiness and the darkness. Maybe he sensed somewhere inside him that these words could only come to life, could only achieve reality when spoken into the face of, breathed in by another human being, the one person he could turn to for consolation in the face of this overwhelming force, who could perhaps save him from both the fear of madness and the fear of the divine. And that was Khadija, radiallahu anha. So she goes on to describe how he went home and took refuge in his house and sought comfort in his wife. He says, "I have been in fear for my life," was the first thing he said. "I think I must have gone mad." Trembling, shuddering, almost convulsively, he begged Khadija to hold him, hide him under her shawl. "Cover me," he pleaded, his head in her lap, like a small child seeking shelter from the terrors of the night. And that terror alone was enough to convince her that what her husband had experienced was real. Khadija reacted, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. Khadija reacted as though this was what she had been half expecting all along, as though she had seen in Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam what he had barely glimpsed in himself. When he said he feared he'd gone mad, she simply shook her head. "May God save you from madness, my dear," she said. "God would not do such a thing to you since he knows your truthfulness, your trustworthiness, and kindness. Such a thing cannot be." And once he told her everything that had happened, her calm conviction was reinforced. "By him in whose hands is my soul," she said, "I hope that you may be the prophet of this people." And we know from the Sīra accounts that the comfort that he found in Khadija and in his relationship with her was one of the main things that anchored him throughout this very tumultuous period when he received the first revelations and within the first year of his trying to make public the message of Islam. There are a few other examples, and I will just share two of them because I think they're excellent examples of what I'm talking about here. One is a hadith, and I don't have the citation with me here, but if anyone's interested, I'm happy to find it later, that the Prophet, and the hadith says, it's from Aisha bint Abi Bakr, the Prophet invited me on a day of Eid to watch the Abyssinians who were playing in the mosque, displaying their skills with spears. The Prophet asked, "Would you like to watch?" I said, "Yes." So I stood behind him. He lowered his shoulder so I could put my chin on it. I did, and leaned with my face on his cheek and watched. Eventually, he asked me several times if I wanted to leave, and I said every time, "Please wait." I wasn't actually interested in watching, but on that day, I wanted women to know my status with the Prophet. So this is a great hadith because it shows the intimacy that Aisha shared with the Prophet publicly, but also the ways in which she was navigating this terrain as one of the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. The other example is of Asma bint Abi Bakr, and she is a very tough case because she is exemplary as a woman in so many ways for Muslims in general, especially for Muslim women. But her domestic her marital relationship was a very tough one. And if we analyze it in the context of, sort of our culture now, we would say that she was in something of an abusive situation, right? But that's a very hard thing to say about a Prophet's companion, but we standing from our culturally grounded perspectives often cast these kinds of judgments. But anyway, she, Asma bint Abi Bakr, just used to spend a lot of her time tending to her husband, who is Zubayr ibn al-Awwam's parcel of land, his horse, and his camel. And in one account, I think this is from Ibn Sa'd's Tabaqat, she says that she used to carry these really heavy loads of date stones, date pits, home, from Zubayr's land back to their home, and that was about 2 miles, a distance of about 2 miles. And one day the Prophet came upon her as she was on her journey home on foot, again, with these really heavy bags, and he offered her a ride behind him on whatever he was riding, probably a donkey. And she said, no, I'm really scared that my husband's going to get jealous. And when she told her husband about this, he said, you know, it's harder for me to hear about you carrying these very heavy sacks home for 2 miles than it is for me to have you share the Prophet's mount. In addition to these, I mean, there really are so many such examples, but we have examples like Asma bint Yazid, another female companion who's known to have fought in battles alongside the Prophet. Women report that the Prophet used to share meals with them. He would stop by to check in on their families in times of joy, in times of sorrow. And for people who are trying to understand the Prophet's domestic relations, and I'm talking about domestic very broadly speaking here, communal relations, these mundane, casual accounts are really important. They're just as important as the accounts that are showing him to be a military leader or a strategist, because they show him to be a leader who is intimately involved in the life of his community, in the daily life of his community. He shared friendships, he shared meals, he shared laughter, he shared sorrow, he shared entertainment. And that, I have to say, is sometimes a very different model from what we see emerging in Muslim leadership, where charismatic leaders are often removed from the daily concerns of their communities, often do not share in casual pleasures and casual relationships with men and women. I mean, I think there is a tremendous fixation with gender relations and gender boundaries in all Muslim communities, and I think the Seerah, accounts from the Seerah can help us to move away from these types of fixations towards a deeper engagement with the humaneness and the humanity of human relationships, whether they're with men or with women. So I've gone over, and I'm getting close to my time, but I went over these 3 sort of case studies, and I want to briefly go over what might be referred to as the challenge of the Sīra literature, and that alongside these potential energy accounts, as I've called them, there are many that don't sit well with us. And Dr. Jasser in the previous talk alluded, or he engaged with the issue of miracles and the accounts of the miracles that really do not resonate well with many Muslims today and may actually even be alienating. And there are accounts like this in the Sīra literature. One of them, which again is very, very well circulated, is that one of the daughters of the Prophet, likely Fatima radiallahu anha, went to him complaining about her husband, and she showed the Prophet the trace of a blow that he had hit her, right? I mean, that is, her husband had hit her. And the Prophet said to her, "Oh, my daughter, go back to your husband in your home. Certainly, a woman cannot be held to be virtuous unless her husband asks anything extraordinary from her. So if a husband orders his wife to go from Mount Aswad to Mount Ahmar and back, this is right. And if I had ever thought of ordering a human being to prostrate before another, I would have ordered the wife to prostrate herself before the husband." So again, a report that is widely circulated and that has given rise to much debate and I would say angst within the Muslim community about how to deal with this legacy of the Sīra literature. And when we look at Muslim responses, I mean, there really is a wide spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, you see those who say you have to accept them. Okay, this is all part of the prophetic model, and whether or not they're in agreement with your social and cultural context, it doesn't really matter. That's the prophetic model, and you have to follow it and abide by it. At the other end of the spectrum, of course, you have those who reject these. They There is this whole idea of hadith criticism, whether it's Western-based or coming from the Muslim tradition itself, which rejects many of these reports as false. And then there's, I would say, some kind of an intermediate stance that says, okay, you have to accept them as possibly being true, but they're reflections of a historical moment in time, and we don't have to use these to guide our own lives. I don't want to engage with this whole spectrum. I want to just conclude with a few things, with a few points. And the first of those is that I think, as an academic partly, but also just as a Muslim who's interested in history, that you have to embrace and engage with the Sīra literature in its entirety. You have to know it. You can't just pick and choose the parts that work for you, all right? You need to read it all, partly because they're amazing historical reflections, if not of the Prophet's time, but of the ways in which people thought about things like miracles and domestic relations in the centuries after the Prophet. And also, this is very important, I think, for Muslims, you don't want to be taken by surprise when somebody else comes to you and says, hey, did you know about this report that is attributed to the Prophet, about sort of a woman should prostrate to her husband, and you just didn't read it because it didn't, or you didn't engage with it because it didn't sit well with you. So, secondly, I think it's really important to know that Muslims across the generations have been selective in modeling the Prophet's behavior. The American Seerah Project is not the first Seerah project like this. There is a Mamluk Seerah Project, there's an Ayyubid Seerah Project, there's a Mughal Seerah Project, right? So this is part of a very broad historical trajectory, and it's the way in which Muslim communities across time and place have engaged with the tradition of their leader. And lastly, and I would say this is a very strong piece of, I don't know what you want to call it, advice or counsel, I would say that it's very important for Muslims engaged in such a project to be methodical and to be consistent in how the approach to Sīra literature is articulated. Because if the approach is, I just don't like this report, and it doesn't sit well with me because I'm a 21st century American Muslim, so I'm not going to engage with it, or it can't inform my behavior, reformist projects will lose huge chunks of audience. They will not be persuasive. So I would say a methodology has to be developed that accounts for the classical tradition, that accounts for the entirety of the Sīra literature, and that is able to selectively adapt it to make sense for this context, for the American Muslim context. So thank you very much. Run out of time.